The snow fell in slow, deliberate flakes over the forests of Alsace. It covered the wreckage of trucks and the bodies of men with an indifferent grace, as if nature itself were tired of deciding who lived and who didn't. In the ruined village of Wingen-sur-Modder, Corporal Daniel Mercer crouched behind a collapsed wall, clutching a rifle that felt heavier with each breath. The air was still, but every tree seemed to whisper that something terrible was coming. It was January 1945, and everyone thought the war was nearly over. Paris had been freed, the Ardennes was collapsing, and the soldiers of the 45th Infantry Division believed they'd be home by spring. But that night, as the temperature sank below freezing, and the horizon glowed faintly from artillery fire, the old war returned in a new disguise. Germany, cornered and bleeding, had launched one final offensive, Operation Nordwind. Few outside the front even knew its name. Mercer's platoon had been sent to hold the ridgeline above the village. Their maps were wrong, their radio half frozen, and the enemy closer than anyone realized. From the forest came the muted clank of tracks, the faint murmur of men moving through snow. Private Collins, a boy from Ohio, who had never seen a mountain before, leaned close and whispered, "Do you hear that?" Mercer nodded. He had heard it for hours. The first shell landed in the river. The second tore through the church steeple. The explosion rolled down the valley like thunder trapped in stone. The platoon opened fire blindly into the trees, muzzle flashes strobing against the snow. For a few minutes the night became pure chaos, shouts, rifle cracks, the dull thump of mortars. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the sound stopped. Only the wind remained. When the silence came, it was worse than the noise. Mercer crawled toward what was left of the church and found the bell half buried in snow. Its surface was cracked, and through the fissure he could see the reflection of flames. He thought of home, of the warmth of a kitchen, and his mother's voice calling him to supper, and wondered if such a place still existed. At dawn, the survivors gathered in the square. The village was gone, reduced to skeleton chimneys and drifting smoke. A sergeant took attendance. Half the names went unanswered. Someone said reinforcements were coming. Someone else said the Germans were already behind them. Mercer looked down the road toward Bitchy, where the mountains rose black against the white sky, and saw movement. Columns of men in grey marching through the snow, as if time itself had turned backward. The attack came from everywhere at once. Mortar fire burst across the ridge, shattering the thin crust of ice and spraying frozen dirt. Mercer ran until his legs gave out, diving into a drainage ditch beside a barn that still smouldered. Inside, a wounded French civilian lay on a straw mattress, his face pale and eyes wide. Mercer knelt beside him, offering water he didn't have enough of. "They're coming again," the man whispered. His breath smelled of smoke and fear. All across Alsace, the lines buckled. German tanks, panthers with frost on their armor, rolled out of the forests like ghosts of another year. American and French units that had thought themselves safe found themselves surrounded in villages no one could pronounce. Civilians fled into the hills, dragging sleds piled with bedding and bread. The sky was a dull white that gave no sense of direction. Compass needles spun uselessly near the frozen riverbanks. In Strasbourg, headquarters refused to believe the scale of the assault. Orders came down to hold every position, even as those positions ceased to exist. In the chaos, companies disappeared without record. A single village might change hands 3 times in one day. For the soldiers on the ground, maps meant nothing. The only truth was the direction of gunfire and the smell of cordite in the snow. Mercer's unit linked up with remnants of another division near Reipertswiller. They were ordered to hold the road junction at all costs. All costs, the captain repeated, his voice flat. By the second night, the men had stopped asking what that meant. Frostbite blackened fingers, weapons jammed. They melted snow in helmets for water and burned furniture for heat. The snow fell harder, thick and relentless, muting the world to a muffled hum. From the hills came the faint strains of a German marching song carried on the wind. It was eerie, almost gentle. Mercer pressed his back against the ruined wall and listened until he could no longer tell whether the sound was real or just the echo of exhaustion. He wondered if the men singing were any warmer than he was, or if they too had forgotten what victory was supposed to feel like. By the fourth day, the line near Reipertswiller was collapsing. The Germans had infiltrated through the forest, cutting communications and isolating small groups of Americans. Snow hid everything: movement, bodies, blood. Mercer and what remained of his squad withdrew toward the hills, carrying their wounded on a door torn from a farmhouse. Every step was a negotiation with gravity and frostbite. At sunset, the forest turned the color of dying embers. Artillery flashes flickered beyond the trees, distant and directionless. Mercer found shelter in a stone hut used by hunters before the war. Inside, the air smelled of pine and old smoke. The men huddled together, speaking little. One prayed, one cursed. One just stared at the wall, as if words might break whatever spell kept them alive. They spent the night listening. Sometimes they heard engines, sometimes voices, sometimes nothing at all. The sound of boots crunching on snow could mean friend or enemy. Mercer kept his rifle across his knees and thought about the letter in his pocket, the one he had written but never sent. He had started it in November, back when he believed he'd be home for Christmas. Now the paper was soft from sweat, the ink blurred. He couldn't remember what it said. In the morning they saw shapes moving through the mist. A patrol, American by the look of their helmets. Mercer stood and waved. The figures did not wave back. The first shot struck the tree beside him, showering bark and ice. He dropped to the ground and returned fire. The forest exploded with noise. When it ended, the air smelled of gunpowder and sap. The shapes were gone. No bodies, no tracks, just silence. He realized then that the war had become a kind of dream, one where nothing stayed solid for long. The front no longer had edges, only directionless struggle. He was fighting shadows in a land that did not want to be remembered. On the fifth day, the cold deepened until even breath seemed to freeze in the air. The forest creaked under its own weight, branches snapping like rifle shots. Mercer's squad was down to 9 men. They had no food left, only coffee grounds dissolved in snow water. When they found an abandoned German aid post, they tore open ration tins stamped with eagles and ate without guilt. The chocolate tasted of metal. At dusk, they heard the distant rumble of tanks. The sound rolled through the valleys like thunder dragged across stone. Mercer climbed a slope to get a better view. From the tree line he saw flashes of light far to the east. Muzzle fire, artillery, maybe both. It meant the line was still alive somewhere. He turned to go back and slipped, crashing through the crust of snow into a hollow. When he stood, he found himself staring at a frozen body half buried in white, German uniform, eyes open. The man looked almost peaceful. Mercer closed them with a gloved hand and whispered something he did not believe. The wind answered with a sigh that might have been words. By midnight, the snow began again. They moved south. guided by a faint orange glow on the horizon. It could have been fire or dawn. It didn't matter. Anything that wasn't forest felt like hope. When they reached the road, they saw wrecks of tanks scattered like toys, their tracks burned into ice. A signpost lay in the ditch, the letters blackened. No one could tell which way led home. The glow turned out to be a village, Hatton, though the sign had been blasted in two. The Americans had dug in there alongside French troops, turning cellars into bunkers and barns into strongpoints. Mercer's squad stumbled in at first light, frost clinging to their coats. A lieutenant with a face full of soot looked them over and said, "Welcome to hell." The front here was measured in streets, not miles. Every house had been fought for, lost, and fought for again. The air smelled of plaster dust and blood. Civilians huddled in basements, praying in whispers. Children played with empty shell casings. Dogs had vanished. No one asked why. At night, the artillery never stopped. It came from both directions, an endless conversation in explosions. Mercer was assigned to a machine gun team covering the main road. Across the fields he could see the spires of Rittershofen, where more fighting raged. Between the two villages stretched a mile of flat ground, churned into frozen mud. The men called it the corridor. Anyone who crossed it died. For 3 days they held. The Germans attacked in waves, tanks leading, infantry following through smoke. The snow turned grey with soot. When ammunition ran low, they fired single shots, counting each one aloud. One for him, one for me. The rhythm kept them sane. On the 4th night, reinforcements finally arrived. Tired men from the 79th Division, faces hollow, eyes rimmed red. They brought rumours that the offensive was failing, that Hitler had thrown his last cards. Mercer wanted to believe them. He also knew rumours were just another kind of weapon. By mid-January, the battle for Alsace had become a frozen stalemate. Villages changed hands daily, each one reduced a little further to rubble. Mercer moved between outposts carrying messages because the radios froze solid. He learned the shape of every shell hole and the smell of every street. He also learned to stop looking at the faces of the men who replaced the dead. They would be gone soon enough. One morning, after a night of shelling, he found the church in Hatton still standing. Inside, candles burned before an altar shattered by shrapnel. A priest in a torn cassock knelt among the debris, praying over the bodies of soldiers from both armies. Mercer watched from the doorway until the priest looked up. "They all die the same," the old man said. Mercer nodded. He had nothing to add. That afternoon the Germans withdrew for the last time. The silence that followed felt unnatural, as if the land itself were waiting for the next blow. The men did not cheer. They simply sat in the snow, too tired even to speak. A medic lit a cigarette and passed it down the line. When it reached Mercer, he took a drag, though he had never smoked before. The smoke stung his throat and tasted of oil. The order came to move north toward the Rhine. The offensive was over. The last gamble had failed. But as the column marched through the ruins, Mercer looked back at the frozen village and thought of the bodies beneath the snow. It did not feel like victory. It felt like survival pretending to be peace. February brought thaw and mud. The snow melted into rivers that ran brown through the ruins. Supply trucks bogged down. Boots sank ankle deep. The men joked that the ground was swallowing the war. Mercer's battalion was ordered to clear what remained of the Maginot bunkers near the German border. The old fortifications, once symbols of safety, had become graves filled with silence. Inside the tunnels, the air was cold and stale. Flashlights cut cones of light through dust. They found German bodies stacked in corners, faces grey and still. A single radio crackled faintly before dying. Mercer felt the weight of history pressing in, the idea that this war had layered itself atop the last like sediment. Bullet holes on top of bullet holes. Ghosts on top of ghosts. Above ground, the villages began to fill with people again. Civilians returned to what had once been homes. Children stared at the soldiers as if they were creatures from another planet. A woman offered Mercer a loaf of bread, still warm from an oven rebuilt from scrap. He thanked her in broken French. She smiled and said, "It is over now." He wished he could believe her. That night, rain turned to fog. The front was quiet except for the low rumble of distant artillery far to the east. The men slept in their coats, rifles close, unable to trust the stillness. Mercer dreamed of footsteps in snow, of a bell that would not ring, of a letter he could never finish. Weeks later, the 45th Division crossed into Germany. The border was marked only by a sign riddled with bullet holes. Beyond it, the landscape looked the same. Bare trees, ruined farms, fields of frozen mud. Yet the air felt different, heavier. The men marched past the ruins of pillboxes and burned trucks, their breath forming clouds that vanished as quickly as they appeared. In the town of Saarbrücken, Mercer saw the first German civilians they had met since crossing the line. Women in threadbare coats, children with hollow eyes, men too old or too young to fight. They stood along the road watching silently as the column passed. No one waved, no one cursed. The war had burned even the gestures out of them. That night, the division bivouacked in a half-destroyed factory. Mercer sat by a small stove and wrote in his notebook. He listed names of the dead from his squad, one by one, until the page was full. Then he turned the paper over and wrote a single sentence. "We are all temporary." He closed the book and put it away. Outside, snow began to fall again, fine and silent, covering the wreckage with a thin pretense of purity. Somewhere in the dark, a radio played a scratchy recording of a violin. The melody drifted through the factory windows like a memory trying to find its way home. March came with rumors of victory. Men began to count days instead of miles. Letters from home spoke of spring. But the landscape through which they moved was endless grey. Every bridge blown, every field mined. The enemy was retreating, but the cost of each kilometre felt the same. One evening, the column halted near a river swollen with meltwater. The engineers built a temporary bridge from planks and wire. Mercer stood watch as the last light faded. He thought of the first time he had crossed water under fire, back in Alsace. The sound of rushing current was the same, indifferent to what fell into it. When the bridge was done, the men crossed one by one. Halfway over, Mercer stopped and looked down. The water glimmered faintly, reflecting stars through the gaps in the clouds. He felt the pull of the current, the slow drag of everything that had happened trying to carry him with it. He tightened his grip on the rail and kept walking. On the far bank, a chaplain handed out small tin cups of coffee. "Almost over," the man said. Mercer nodded. The words had lost meaning months ago, but he accepted them anyway. Somewhere behind them, artillery boomed once, distant and final. The night swallowed the sound. By April, the war had shrunk to pockets of resistance and the quiet dread of what would follow. The 45th Division pushed east through towns whose names blurred together. Each street smelled of smoke and surrender. German soldiers appeared waving white cloths, their faces grey with fatigue. The Americans disarmed them and moved on. No one celebrated. Mercer had stopped marking days. The calendar in his pocket ended in February, and he saw no reason to replace it. What mattered now was staying alive until the silence arrived. Every night he wrote a few words in his notebook and crossed them out before sleeping. The act itself felt like prayer. In one village they found a school turned into a field hospital. A nurse in a worn Red Cross uniform greeted them in halting English. She asked if the war was truly over. Mercer didn't know how to answer. In the courtyard, children played with the shells of unexploded grenades, tossing them like stones into the mud. He shouted for them to stop, and they laughed at the sound of his voice. That evening, the division received orders to halt. The front had moved beyond them. The road ahead led to Nuremberg, and beyond that, nothing but ruin. The men built fires from broken furniture and sat around them in silence. No speeches, no music, just the sound of wood cracking and the faint hiss of snow turning to steam. When the surrender came, it arrived without fanfare. A message passed from jeep to jeep, repeated until it became rumor and then truth. The guns went quiet. The sky cleared. For the first time in months, the air smelled only of rain. Men walked into the fields and stood there, not knowing what to do with their hands. Mercer found himself on a hillside overlooking the river. Below, the remnants of the German army were being herded into makeshift cages of barbed wire. Thousands of prisoners, silent and still. He watched them for a long time, trying to summon hatred, but all he felt was emptiness. He wondered if they were thinking the same thing he was, that none of it had mattered, that the earth would cover everything soon enough. He opened his notebook and read the first page, written months earlier. We hold until morning. The ink had faded, the paper soft from sweat and snow. He tore the page out, folded it once, and let the wind take it. The scrap danced upward, then vanished into the grey sky. Somewhere behind him, church bells began to ring for the first time in years. The sound was clear and strange, like a language he had forgotten. Years later, long after uniforms and medals had been packed away, Mercer returned to Alsace. The villages had been rebuilt, the scars buried under plaster and paint. Children played where foxholes had once been. The river ran clean again. But the forest remained the same, tall, quiet, indifferent. He followed the old road toward Vingen-sur-Moder. The church had been restored, its bell newly cast. He stood beneath it and listened as it rang the hour. The tone was higher, brighter, but something in it carried the echo of that frozen night. He closed his eyes and saw snow falling over fire, heard voices calling through smoke. At the edge of the village, a memorial stood among the pines. The names were carved deep into stone, letters filled with moss. He traced them with his fingers and found his own squad among them, Collins, Ramos, Vickery, and the others. Below their names was a single inscription in French. Ils ont tenu, they held. Mercer stood there until dusk. When the wind rose, it carried the smell of pine and rain, clean and sharp. He whispered a line he had once written and never sent. We lived through winter, but the winter lives through us. Then he turned back down the road, the sound of the new bell following him